this man here has been defrauded by your mother. You must return $15,000 immediately, or you will be arrested for fraud." Suddenly, a police officer visited my home, along with a young man claiming to have been defrauded by my mother. I couldn't comprehend what I was being told at that moment. However, believing that my honest and kind mother could never do such a thing, I firmly shook my head. "That's impossible." As I insisted that it must be some mistake, the officer thrust a warrant in front of my face. Even I was speechless when faced with an arrest warrant. However, the situation took an unexpected turn after that. "My name is Chris Morgan. I'm a salaried worker at a general company. I'm busy with work every day, but I'm satisfied as I find my job fulfilling. While leading such a busy life, I took care of my mother when I returned home. My mother had always been frail, and once collapsed from overwork while working part-time at a supermarket. Since then, she had quit her part-time job and was now recuperating at home. She did her daily tasks slowly by herself, but I helped with cooking, laundry, and shopping. Of course, my father helped with shopping and walks when he had time. But he was busy with his job, so I mostly took care of my mother. I never found taking care of my mother to be a bother or unpleasant. She raised me to this point. Out of filial piety, I was looking after my mother. However, she always seemed concerned and kept being apologetic. "Chris, I'm really sorry. You must be tired from work, and yet you're helping me." I shook my head in response. "Don't worry about it, Mom." My mother's apologies were repeated every day. Although I really didn't mind, I couldn't seem to convey that to her properly. Not just in words, but I tried to show it in my actions too. Though I wasn't sure if she truly understood. That's how my frustrating days were going. A few days later, while I was cleaning the house, the doorbell rang. Thinking it might be a delivery, I opened the front door, only to find a man in a police uniform and a young man around 20 years old. I tilted my head in confusion. "Excuse me? Is there something you need at my house?" When I asked, the self-proclaimed officer showed me a police badge. "May I have a moment of your time?" As he said that, he stared at me intently. I tensed up slightly, and he quickly put the badge back in his pocket. Then, he unfolded a piece of paper labeled "arrest warrant" and showed it to me. "Actually, there is an arrest warrant out for your mother on fraud charges," I exclaimed in surprise. "For my mother?" The officer nodded. As I looked at the paper in disbelief, I saw my mother's name written on it, with a fraud listed under the charges. Noticing my intense scrutiny, the officer quickly folded the paper and put it away. I shook my head frantically in response. No. This must be some mistake. Did my mother really commit fraud? Could you be mistaken about her identity? As I asked this, unable to believe it, the officer nodded solemnly. I understand it's hard for a son to believe, but unfortunately, it's true. Your mother defrauded this man of his money. He gestured towards the young man. The man had been looking down the whole time and didn't raise his head even when I looked at him. Finally noticing my gaze, he slightly raised his head, but quickly looked down again. As I continued to watch him, the officer began to speak. "This is Mr. Anderson. He worked at the same place as your mother." Mr. Anderson nodded slightly, though it was unclear whether it was a nod or an acknowledgement. I watched him, thinking. It was true that my mother had worked part-time at a supermarket until a few months ago. Maybe that's where they met. Maybe that's when they had this conversation. As I was coming to terms with this, the officer, speaking for Mr. Anderson, began. He was complaining about not being able to pay his tuition fees when your mother said to him, "I can increase it for you with stock investments." He gave her his entire savings of $15,000, which he had earned from part-time jobs. But since then, there has been no contact. The officer looked at me as he said this. Still unable to believe it, I shook my head. No, it can't be. I'm sorry, I just can't believe it. The officer let out an exaggerated sigh. I understand how you feel. It's hard to believe when a police officer and a victim of fraud suddenly come to arrest your mother for fraud. But please accept the reality. I remained speechless, and the officer continued. Mr. Anderson says he will withdraw the complaint. If he gets back his $15,000 right away, then the arrest warrant will be nullified. What will you do? Hearing this, I looked at Mr. Anderson. He stood there, still looking uneasy and mostly looking down. I addressed him. Mr. Anderson? He looked up at me with exaggerated surprise. Observing his behavior, I asked cautiously. Excuse me. Just to confirm, may I ask when you gave my mother the $15,000? Mr. Anderson looked at the self-proclaimed officer. After the officer silently nodded, Mr. Anderson, looking somewhat downcast, answered. What? Oh, right. I think it was about a month ago, maybe? As Mr. Anderson answered hesitantly, I pressed him further. What? Don't you remember? Such an important matter. Mr. Anderson, you were defrauded of $15,000 by my mother, right? $1.5 million is a lot of money. Are you saying you don't remember? That's a lie, right? When was it really? As I bombarded him with questions, Mr. Anderson avoided eye contact and fell silent. As I was about to question him further, the self-proclaimed officer stepped between us and exclaimed. Anyway. He interrupted us with a shout. Startled by his voice, Mr. Anderson and I turned to him. The officer, seeming impatient, said, Mr. Morgan. Are you going to return the money now or not? You don't want to have a criminal in your family, do you? There's still time to make it right. What are you going to do? Feeling pressured by the officer's intensity, I nodded. Right. I understand. As a family member, I want to take responsibility. However, I don't have such a large amount of money here. May I call my father? The officer nodded with a satisfied look. Yes, of course. Go ahead. I took out my smartphone and said, I'll call my father to bring the $15,000 immediately. Please wait inside until then. As I said this, the officer nodded and looked at Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson was also looking at the officer and smiling. Despite my suspicions about the two, I let them into the house and led them to a room. Please wait in this room. As I opened the door, the two looked at me in surprise. I addressed them. I'm going to call my father. Please enter and wait inside. The self-proclaimed officer and Mr. Anderson, looking uneasy, nodded stiffly and entered the room as I urged them. After finishing the call to my father, I entered the room to find the officer and Mr. Anderson standing there, looking lost. I spoke to them. Sorry for the delay. My father will be back soon with the $15,000. The officer turned around with a startled look, and Mr. Anderson stood there, staring at a point, his face turning even paler than before. It made sense. The room I led them to had my bedridden mother lying in the bed. Yes. My mother had been ill, and now she was completely bedridden. I spoke while looking at her. My mother has been like this for a month now. She was always frail, but her condition has worsened recently. Hearing this, the self-proclaimed officer looked at me awkwardly. Mr. Anderson was completely lost for words. I continued, looking at the two. I never realized she was committing fraud in such a state. I still can't believe how she could have done it. As I spoke with my head down, the two began to whisper to each other. I heard Mr. Anderson's panicked voice. No, no. She was supposed to be in the hospital. Why is she here? The self-proclaimed officer responded in a frantic tone. Hey. You checked properly, right? What's going on here? Explain. This is no good. You said her mother wasn't here, so I did this. The officer, seemingly flustered, questioned Mr. Anderson. They seemed to have forgotten my presence and began arguing. I addressed them. But it's strange, isn't it? No matter how you think about it, my mother, in such a bedridden state, couldn't have committed fraud. How did she do it, Mr. Anderson? Were you really defrauded by her? Was it really a month ago? Can you explain it to me, from your own mouth? As I bombarded Mr. Anderson with questions, he turned pale and responded. No, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't Mrs. Morgan. Maybe it was someone else, maybe? Mr. Anderson said with a dry laugh, and the officer looked away, appearing troubled. I continued, looking at Mr. Anderson. Do you lose a large sum of money over a misunderstanding? Mistake the person who defrauded you? I'd remember if it were me, Mr. Anderson. Why doubt my mother now? And how did you know she was recently hospitalized? And officer? Suddenly called out, the self-proclaimed officer looked at me in surprise. I said, what did you mean earlier? Why is it a problem if my mother is here? The officer replied with an awkward laugh. Did I say something like that? I nodded. Yes. You said it while whispering to Mr. Anderson. The officer remained silent with a wry smile. Mr. Anderson looked at me, his face drained of color. As I observed them, my father entered the room. Chris, sorry I'm late. As I turned around, my father nodded slightly. The officer and Mr. Anderson let out small cries of alarm as they saw my father. In front of the two, my father apologized with a look of regret. It seems my wife has caused trouble. I'm really sorry. Mr. Anderson, was it? Here is $15,000. Please check it. Mr. Anderson, with trembling hands, received the thick envelope my father offered. The officer, his face pale, peered into the envelope along with him. As I looked at my father, he was watching the two with a serious expression. A few minutes later, after Mr. Anderson had really checked the contents, he spoke to my father with a trembling voice. Yes, there's definitely $15,000 here. I've received it. After confirming that, Mr. Anderson, with trembling hands, put the thick envelope into his bag, the self-proclaimed officer hurriedly said, Then, we'll take our leave now. Since you've returned the money properly, we'll withdraw the complaint and cancel the arrest. Please rest assured. Before I could say anything, the self-proclaimed officer and Mr. Anderson quickly attempted to leave the room. That's when my father shouted, Detain them. At his shout, two men apprehended the self-proclaimed officer and Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson screamed while the self-proclaimed officer yelled, You can't do this to a police officer. You won't get away with this. Do you realize what you're doing? My father then took something out of his chest pocket and showed it to the clamoring duo. What a coincidence. I happen to be a police officer too. Seeing the words Assistant Police Chief on what my father showed, the self-proclaimed officer looked up at my father, his face turning pale. Indeed. When I called my father, I told him about the arrest warrant issued for my bedridden mother on fraud charges. That a man claiming to be a victim of fraud had come with a man claiming to be a police officer. And that I knew all of it was a lie, and had informed him in advance. I'm pretending to be deceived to buy time, so please come quickly. My father had said over the phone, "Understood. I'll be right there. Chris, hold them off for 30 minutes. So, I led the two to the room where my bedridden mother was and waited for my father. My father, after putting away his police badge, spoke calmly. "Do you guys know?" The self-proclaimed officer and Mr. Anderson, their faces drained of blood, looked up silently at my father. Looking down at the two, my father said, "The moment you accepted the money, it became a case of fraud. Falsely claiming to be a police officer. Forging badges and police IDs is a crime of impersonating an official. Creating your own arrest warrant amounts to forgery of public documents." The self-proclaimed officer gave up trying to free his restrained arms. And Mr. Anderson became docile with a look of despair. As my father and the others began to take the two away, a faint voice was heard, and I couldn't help but shout, "Shh! Quiet. Dad. Mom." My father looked at my mother's face in panic. "Hey. Do you recognize me? Chris is here too." As my father and I looked at my mother, she woke up and said with a small smile, "I recognize you. David. Chris. It's quite lively, isn't it?" My mother, calling out our names, chuckled wryly. My father, relieved, turned back and nodded. "Thank you. Your actions woke up my wife. Who would have thought this would be the trigger?" Life is unpredictable. But a crime is a crime. You'll have to pay for it. Take them away. The self-proclaimed officer and Mr. Anderson were taken away following my father's words. I watched the scene, feeling a slight sense of gratitude towards the two. Until now, my mother had never talked so much even when she woke up. Her eyes were often vacant, and it was hard to understand what she wanted to convey. But this time was different. She called out to my father and me, laughing at the commotion. As I looked at my mother, she was talking to my father. My father, standing up, patted my shoulder. "Chris. Thank you. Your quick thinking allowed us to arrest those two. It's not clear yet, but given their practiced manner, there might be other crimes. I'll be late again, but please take care of your mother." I nodded. "Of course, Dad. Mom and I will wait for your return. So take care and don't push yourself." My father nodded and left the house with his colleagues waiting outside. After that, my mother began to show signs of recovery. She started to come out of her room little by little, spending her days in the living room, sunbathing in the garden on sunny days, and going for walks with my father. Seeing my mother getting better and my father's happy smile made me feel content.